So I guess I can start trying to orient us a little bit. So my name is Jordan Vanderhagen. I kind of started the Duluth Waterfront Collective. To go back to the beginning, when I was still in school, I was trying to figure out what to do for my design thesis before my last year. And I was living in Duluth, and I walked across the Lake Avenue overpass and was nearly hit by a vehicle. And so it literally almost hit me that, this would be a good idea for what I do my thesis on. Just understanding that if this wasn't safe for me as a fully able young white person, that, there are a lot more people in our community who would struggle with this more than I would. So that's what I did my thesis on. And then I came to Duluth afterwards and kind of wanted to keep the idea moving, just to see if it could gain any traction. And as I got to know more people in town, we kind of agreed that, maybe the freeway wasn't necessary at all in our downtown. And so both the concept and the group kind of grew from there. So we came up with a preliminary concept. We knew that it wasn't like perfect by any means, but we wanted to put it out to the community, just in the hopes that it would encourage people to get involved and help us find what that right answer is. So we published a website, and it worked, and we got a lot of feedback from people. We heard from locals who felt unsafe taking their families across the 35 corridor. We've heard from people with disabilities who were unable to get across the freeway safely. We heard from travelers who said that whether intentionally or on accident, they often will bypass Duluth entirely just because the process of getting into our downtown and waterfront is so confusing. And we heard from tourists who have visited Duluth a lot and have never been to our downtown because the freeway creates such a separation between the two. And so basically, we continued working on this concept, and people kept asking questions like, how do I help? What are the next steps? What happens to traffic when you get rid of a freeway? And, this isn't something that I've done before, and nobody in our group has done anything like this before. So we don't really have all of the answers, and we're kind of out here almost winging it in a way, but in a very informed way. But we put together this panel today so that hopefully we would be able to connect people in our community with others who have walked the walk and gone through this process, to hopefully connect everyone and get some of those questions answered. So today we have 3 additional panelists. We've got Maria, Ben, and Peter, who have all been involved, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a second here. Norman was also going to be joining us, but he had a medical emergency that came up at the last minute. So unfortunately, he won't be able to give his presentation today, but it's a beautiful day here in Duluth, so I'm sure people will appreciate the chance to dip out of here a little bit earlier than expected. So if we want to do introductions quick, maybe Ben, you can start, and then we'll go to Maria and then Peter.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. I'm Ben Crowther. I'm the program manager for the Congress for the New Urbanism's Highways to Boulevards initiative. And part of why I'm here is because we've included Duluth's I-35 in our most recent Freeways Without Futures report, which comes out every 2 years and looks at what we call some of the, it's the highways that are conditions are prime for removal. So I'll talk a little bit about that today and what CNU does in the realm of Highways to Boulevards projects.
Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be invited to participate in this very important conversation. I'm Maria Furguiele. I am the Executive Director of the Community Design Center, Rochester. I have been the Executive Director for the past 5 years. But I have been involved with this organization for over a dozen years as a volunteer, as a board member. And I went right into architecture right out of high school. So my degree is a bachelor's of architecture. I had a design firm that specialized in residential single family homes. And then my love and passion for community design really grew with this organization. So I have a dream job here. I'm very pleased to be here to share a community perspective to these projects.
I guess I could introduce myself. I'm Peter Park. Good to see you all. I'm a city planner. I was a planning director in Milwaukee and planning director in Denver. I'm now in Denver, where I have a consulting practice assisting cities with planning, transportation issues, and zoning code issues, among a variety of other things. But when I was planning director in Milwaukee, I led and oversaw the replacement of the freeway with a boulevard. So we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned, not only from Milwaukee, but also assisting other cities in these endeavors.
Great. Well, to kick this off, since we have a little more time, I wasn't planning on really talking about our project in specifics too much, but just for people who are here who aren't familiar with what we've been trying to accomplish, I'm going to just kind of jump into this a little bit. So this is a screenshot of Interstate 35 in downtown Duluth. You can see on the left side is our downtown area, and on the right side is the waterfront. And if you count out all of these lanes, you'll just start to realize it's kind of absurd for the amount of traffic that we see in Duluth. And when you hear about projects like the Twin Ports interchange, which are incredibly expensive, and then you realize, someday that this stretch of freeway is going to need to be rebuilt, probably to a similar price point, you start to wonder, what are our alternatives? Is that what we have to do? What could this look like instead? And so, especially when you actually look at the community, so this area surrounding the downtown corridor of I-35 is one of the poorest census tracts in Minnesota. And so what that means is that a lot of the people in this neighborhood, whether by their own choice or by their economic circumstances, don't even own a vehicle. So this chunk of freeway takes up about 20% of what is considered our downtown area by land. And it doesn't even serve 33% of the people living nearby. And so it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense if we're trying to plan our transportation networks in a way that is serving everybody in the community. And so if you don't have a car, this is what it feels like. A freeway by default is a mode of travel that is exclusive only to people in vehicles. And so if you're not somebody who has a car, this is what you've got to work with to get to the waterfront. And then even for traffic, we see the way that the freeway has congested our downtown and Canal Park areas by forcing everybody to go into these sort of bottlenecks to get across the area or onto the freeway. So Interstate 35 itself is pretty under capacity, whereas, the Lake Avenue overpass is almost at, I think, 200% of what it was intended to handle, or at least at the point when this information came out, it was. So even for cars, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're trying to figure out, how can we rethink this area to spur economic growth, create green space, improve safety and mobility, and then create a unified downtown. And so by replacing this infrastructure barrier that keeps people apart with a series of places and spaces that are intended to bring people together, we can kind of create shared experiences amongst people of diverse backgrounds to improve understanding and compassion within our community, especially after all of this time where we've been isolated socially and politically and amongst so many other lines. It's really important for us to kind of think of ways we can come together. So this timeline's a little out of date, but our general process for this project was to initially release our concept and then grow community support, generate ideas and feedback as we got more people involved, and then update our concept plans, and then create new visualizations, which hopefully will get more people excited and more people involved, and so on and so forth until the time comes when MnDOT decides to rethink this area, at which point we hope to be able to leverage that with the community support we've generated. And so looking at our concept, we're really trying to rethink this in a more multimodal capacity. So there would still be a pretty reasonable vehicle corridor running through this space. We intend to design that to be able to handle the traffic that we see in our downtown. But in addition, it would also be able to accommodate rail traffic, bike and pedestrian traffic, and then also reintroduce a street network into the downtown and Canal Park areas to really kind of stitch them together. And then with the space that remains, it'll be broken up into one of two uses. 20 acres of this land could go towards new development options. This gives us an opportunity to create things that are missing from our downtown and figure out what our community's priorities are and address those in a way where we don't have to demolish any existing development. All we're getting rid of is concrete here, so it's not displacing anybody. And then with the remaining space, we would be then creating new parks, greenways, parkways, and connecting existing green spaces together to create a system of amenities for people in the community, but also creating spaces to overlay green infrastructure and treat stormwater and handle other environmental concerns that our city is facing. And so just the preliminary concept that we've put together decreases roadway pretty considerably. It almost doubles green space. It doubles the amount of buildable space, which increases tax revenues. And it also decreases our road maintenance burden that we have to face as a community. So again, this is kind of what we're looking at right now, and this is what we're proposing. And so, I mean, you can really go deep into this and overlay a lot of different things. And these are just items that we've heard from people in the community of what they want to see. So transit options, rail options, green infrastructure, new developments, and then maintaining traffic flow to some degree. And so, I mean, we have a real opportunity here to think about what this space could be in terms of, you know, becoming something that the community can really enjoy more than they can with the freeway as it is. But in order to do that, we have to get rid of the freeway first. And so how do we do that? That's kind of the question we're hoping to answer today. So as we move on through our next speakers, hopefully we can come away with some answers and keep this moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Jordan. That was a great overview of what you all are doing. And I even saw some new things, which is exciting. It looks like you guys have really been working on developing the concept. So let me do the infamous screen share dance here. And what are you seeing? What are you seeing here?
It looks right, the end of the road, right?
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so to build off what Jordan has said, you know, I'm going to do a little bit of storytelling about the Highways to Boulevards movement. And storytelling, I think, is really important for campaigns like the Duluth Waterfront Collectives, thinking about, you know, what's happened in the past, what people experience now, and what we can get to in the future. So as I said in my introduction, I'm Ben Crowther. I'm the program manager for the Congress for the New Urbanism's Highways to Boulevards initiative. And since 2008, CNU, we've been gathering data and information on both the benefits and the best practices of highway removal. And we've been working with advocates like the Duluth Waterfront Collective nationwide. And as I also said, we publish every 2 years our Freeways Without Futures report, which in this edition included Duluth's I-35. So I'm here to talk a little bit today about why we included I-35 in the report and where it fits into this larger Highways to Boulevards movement. So we've seen this image already, I-35 through downtown Duluth. For a bit of context, this part is the northern terminus of the nearly 1,600-mile long interstate that goes all the way down to Laredo, Texas, at the other end of the country. The highway is as wide as 8 lanes in some places, that's including the frontage roads. And as Jordan said, it occupies around 20% or so of the land downtown. It's a really significant barrier between downtown and the Lake Superior waterfront. And as those of you who live there know, there's only 3 connections to get across it: Lake Avenue, Harbor Drive, and the pedestrian Sky Bridge. And it wasn't always this way. I stole this image from a post on Reddit. I think it's actually one that Jordan made. But these 2 images come from the same perspective. You have one before the highway and one after the highway. And circled in the background there, you have the lift bridge to orient you. And then each of the 2 curbs on the near side of Lake Avenue remain the same. But other than that, this landscape's changed completely. Above, we have this once vibrant corridor. You have people in the streets, and that's been swapped out for a road that's really only good at one thing: moving cars. Although, as we just saw, it's oftentimes a congested road, so it's not even necessarily good at that all the time. And outside of that, this road, Lake Avenue and I-35 and the other roads that I-35 connects to, they're adding little to the quality of life downtown. And so here's where those buildings along Lake Avenue went. This is the construction of I-35. It starts in Duluth in 1967, and the downtown portion is largely completed between 87 and 91, which is really late in the era of interstate building. And this delay happens because of the efforts of citizen-led advocacy groups in Duluth who stood opposed to the original plan for I-35, which you see here. Now, the highway builders of this era had intended I-35 to be an elevated highway that's routed directly along the lakefront and has to be protected by a concrete seawall. So it really goes without saying that this plan would have put an end to Duluth's enjoyment of its waterfront. But in response to this plan, you get Duluth residents forming several different advocacy groups in an attempt to steer the highway's path as it approaches downtown. They're ultimately able to direct that to some degree, preserving the natural asset of the waterfront, but are unsuccessful in keeping the highway completely out of downtown. So the highway builders and advocates, they reach a compromise which routed the road along the east side of downtown through a series of tunnels and freeway caps, the configuration that exists in Duluth today. And while I was digging into this history, I came across a 2010 article in the Duluth News Tribune, and part of which I think it's worth reading aloud for its impact. So I'll do that. So today it's easy for visitors to see the benefit of the interstate. The Lake Walk Bike and Pedestrian Trail follows the rebuilt shoreline. Young and old alike can wade into the lake, throw stones, or choose to clamber over massive boulders. While they walk or bike, people can admire the 550-foot-long ceramic tile image wall below Lake Place on the outside highway wall. Canal Park is filled with restaurants, hotels, museums, shops, and works of public art. The original Rose Garden in Leif Erikson Park was also reconstructed after the tunnels were built and feature more than 2,000 rose bushes of some 99 varieties and numerous trees, shrubs, and flowers. And downtown Duluth has skywalks and brick streets, thanks to the funds Duluth was allowed to use after it was decided the interstate would not run all the way to 68th Avenue East, one of the options considered at the time. And I really want to highlight this phrase here. It's easy for visitors to see the benefit of the interstate, except that nothing that's listed below actually springs from the presence of the interstate. It's the efforts of advocacy groups like the Citizens for the Integration of Highway and Environment, Stop the Freeway, and the Lakeshore Bypass Committee that achieve this in spite of the construction of the highway, not because of it. So, and freeway revolts like the one that took place in Duluth were actually quite common in cities across America. And they resulted in things like this: amenities that, are connected to the construction of the highway aren't actually, the highway doesn't provide them. And so these freeway revolts, their vision for the benefits of a city without the highway, serve as the foundation for the contemporary highways to boulevards movement. And I was just reading, earlier, a great book that I'll highly recommend, People Before Highways, that tells the story of a freeway revolt in Boston, where I'm based now, and what the city was actually able to build in place of a highway once it talked to its community members about what they wanted to see out of the corridor where the highway was proposed. So to come back to the Highways to Boulevards movement, it seeks to reclaim the space occupied by urban highways and replace them with the sorts of amenities that the Duluth News Tribune heralds. So far, cities across America have opted 15 times to remove or cover highways and replace them with streets, public spaces, and buildings dedicated to people, not cars. And there are another 30 or so cities, including Duluth, where serious conversations about removing or covering a highway are taking place now. And although all these projects, these 15 different projects, vary sometimes greatly in magnitude and scope, they've all produced largely similar positive outcomes in 3 key areas: public realm, economic development, and health and environment. Each of the cities that have undertaken these projects have opted to measure community progress and a quality of life by a set of metrics other than travel time. But what's this look like on the ground? So I'd like to just dive into a little bit of a brief visual history of the Highways to Boulevards movement. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck California's Bay Area. In Oakland, the double-decker Cypress Freeway in West Oakland collapsed. When Caltrans went to rebuild it, West Oakland residents who contested its original construction mobilized yet again and convinced the state to reroute the freeway to the periphery of their neighborhood rather than directly through it. This is the former route of the Cypress Freeway today, now called the Mandela Parkway. The freeway's right-of-way has been repurposed into a landscape median West Oakland residents are able to enjoy. That same earthquake also damaged San Francisco's Embarcadero Freeway, whose route was never completed due to a 1966 freeway revolt. Rather than repair it, the city opted to remove it and reclaim access to its waterfront. Fast forward a few years, and we're in 2002, the city of Milwaukee chooses to dismantle its Park East Freeway, once again a highway that was never completed due to a freeway revolt. This choice, this active choice to remove a freeway, heralds a new generation of Highways to Boulevard in the Highways to Boulevards movement, one where an act of God isn't required for highway deconstruction. And out of this generation of Highways to Boulevards projects, we get examples like the removal of the Riverfront Parkway in Chattanooga, a city that's on the scale probably more comparable to Duluth than Oakland or San Francisco. In 2004, the city transformed its 4-lane limited access highway into a 2-lane boulevard that provided easy pedestrian access to the waterfront. And it's worth noting here that the old Riverfront Parkway, that 4-lane road, carried approximately 20,000 vehicles a day at its peak. And we'll come back to that number a little later. Then in 2017, Rochester's Inner Loop becomes the most recent addition to the Highways to Boulevards completed projects. And I won't step too much on Maria's toes here. I suspect she's going to talk a lot about this, but by filling in the depressed Inner Loop, the city's able to reclaim 6.5 acres of land for building. It cost $22 million to fill in the Inner Loop and rebuild Union Street. That's this street here. And in the first 2 years after this project's completed, from 2017 to 2019, this $220 million public investment spurs $229 million in economic development, about a 10-fold return. And for what it's worth, the projected life cycle cost for the maintenance and repairs for that section of the highway, if it was to be rebuilt, would have been $34 million. So that's $12 million more to maintain it than the cost of simply removing it. So where's Duluth fit into this story? Why is it included in our Freeways Without Futures report? Well, as Jordan showed us earlier, the Duluth Waterfront Collectives made a very compelling case for its removal. And I just want to add a few things to that. First, because Duluth marks the northern end of I-35 and terminates ingloriously at this four-way intersection just north of downtown, it's effectively what we call a spur highway, like the Embarcadero Freeway or the Park East Freeway in Milwaukee. And these highways, they often end in cities, they're a connection to a larger interstate route, but they're easier to remove because they are an integral part of any sort of larger regional transportation network. And I-35's lack of importance shows in its traffic counts, which have been steadily declining since 1998. They're now at a point where they've actually dipped below the traffic that's on several of Duluth's surface streets. And if we come back to Chattanooga's Riverfront Parkway, that 20,000 trips a day number is around the same amount that the Riverfront Parkway was carrying when it was removed and replaced with a street that's only 2 lanes. But ultimately, this isn't just about removing a highway. It's about building a better city. And there's a tremendous amount of upside to replacing I-35 with a parkway more appropriate for an urban context. Parkway would be more accessible to pedestrians and cyclists with wide sidewalks lined by trees, creating a new cross-city recreation trail. It removed the barrier that limits Duluth's access to Canal Park and prevents the park's visitors from elsewhere making their way into downtown and spending some of their money there. And the Parkway plan also reclaims around 20 acres of land from the highway that can be developed in ways that alleviate housing concerns and provide entrepreneurial opportunities for members of the community. It's a catalytic opportunity to revitalize Duluth's downtown and help the city fund services for its residents by increasing its tax base. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done to get from Duluth's current I-35 to a lakeside parkway. And you'll see, I think, a few samples a day. These projects can take decades. I've hoped to show you all that it's far from impossible to achieve this, and that other cities have embarked upon and successfully completed similar projects. So Duluth, you're not alone. I'd encourage everyone to visit our webpage on the screen here to find additional resources and case studies that show what's possible. And of course, please do reach out to me at my email here. I'm always happy to chat more about highway removal and highways to boulevards projects. And I'll leave it there. Thanks all.
All right, Maria, you're up. And thank you to Ben for the great presentation.
All right, here we are. You can all see that. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. I first of all want to share a little bit of information about what, who we are and what we do as a community design center. The Community Design Center was born out of an ad hoc group of citizens that were a subcommittee of the Rochester Chapter American Institute of Architects, the Urban Design Committee. And they eventually formed the standalone not-for-profit in 2003. We promote design excellence of the built environment as a way to enrich a sense of place, improve sustainability, and enhance the quality of life for all of our residents. We strive to be a resource for both civic leaders and community residents in defining, understanding, promoting, and implementing placemaking strategies for building healthy communities. My forward key's not working.
Uh-oh.
Okay, let me stop share and start over. We'll start here. And we will start from the beginning. And let's see if that works. There we go. Doesn't help to try to save time by presetting everything. And so what I want to first get out of the way is helping you have an understanding of what a community design center is. And for most of us, probably the most relatable definition is the one that is at the bottom of the page that's highlighted in blue. Generally, community design centers traditionally work in economically distressed communities. We are ground zero, helping to organize, educate, and empower community members around concepts of placemaking and community building through the way that they shape their physical environment. And I want to share with you the placemaking definition that I most like, primarily because it has right at its forefront a people-centered approach. And as such, it has an equity component that is already baked into the definition. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how it all began. In the late 1980s or 1990s, I apologize, New York State Department of Transportation proposed to widen University Avenue, which is an arterial that leads east out of our city, from 2 lanes to 4 lanes in order to facilitate commuter traffic. The neighborhood organized in opposition to this project, arguing that the widened roadway would have a negative impact on their fledgling neighborhood. Led by Johnny Monroe, a neighborhood resident and architect, and other resident community leaders, a group of architects and planners assisted the community members in articulating their vision for what they felt would be an ideal neighborhood street. The result is what you see here. And the DOT adopted this plan and it was built largely as shown. The narrow roadway incorporated bump outs to reduce crossing areas for crosswalks, had protected parking lanes, and planted an island, landscaped island, and a very clearly defined and articulated crosswalk square to facilitate pedestrian movement. Overall, the entire roadway was designed to be pedestrian friendly and incorporated wide sidewalks and shaded areas to sit. As a result of this project, the community members determined that they wanted to create a link between the existing Memorial Art Gallery to the west, which you can see noted in the upper left-hand corner, and the Eastman House and Museum of Photography in the lower right-hand corner. This became known as Art Walk, and the trail incorporated public art, custom designed borders for the sidewalks, community art installations all along the trail. The neighborhood became known as the Neighborhood of the Arts and is now one of the most desired neighborhoods in our city. Johnny Monroe and the group of architects became the founding members of the Urban Design Committee of the AIA, and which eventually led to the founding of the Rochester Regional Community Design Center, and we are now renamed the Community Design Center of Rochester. I know, not much better. This is a view of the Art Walk project showing one of the public art installations, a historic building in the works there. So it's quite a beautiful place to be. And I show you this slide just to illustrate the incredible importance that road design can play in creating a transformative impact in placemaking. Shortly after this project was completed, a publication noted that this was an important example of the positive effects of community-based planning. And so I'd like to give you a little bit of an orientation to where we are. Rochester is in upstate New York. Part of our city borders Lake Ontario to the north. You see here that the historic Erie Canal flows directly through the center of the city. And you see that the Genesee River flows north to Lake Ontario. That's right. We have a series of dramatic waterfalls that are right in our downtown and along the way. This long street at an angle here is Main Street. And you see that we have this tremendous railroad that is pretty much an impervious barrier. So this is Rochester in 1930. And what I want you to notice here is mostly the fine-grained texture of the urban pattern. And here we are in 1960, where you begin to see the clearing for the construction of the inner loop. Notice also how that fine grain texture is being consolidated into larger blocks. And here we are in the year 2000, where you very clearly see the result of the inner loop and how it completely separates the downtown district from all of its surrounding neighbors. And that red arrow is an indication to locate the Union Street corridor, which is the Inner Loop East project. And here you see all that was removed and is now dedicated to parking, as our city increasingly strove to accommodate automobiles. Many of these are surface parking lots. And I want you to take particular notice of this large red parcel of parking right here at the elbow of the Inner Loop East project. And so this diagram shows that the Inner Loop project was divided into two projects. One is the Inner Loop East project that was completed, recently completed about 2018. And this is the Inner Loop North project, which is under consideration currently. The dividing line is generally Main Street. So one of the first charrettes that the Community Design Center facilitated, even before we were founded as a standalone not-for-profit, was the Vision 2020, the Vision 2010 Downtown Charrette. This brought 200 residents to share their vision for the downtown, and this happened in May of 2000. This is one of the renderings that was created at the Downtown Charrette. Here you can begin to see how people envisioned the inner loop being filled in and reconfigured. And a lot of the information that was gathered at that downtown community charrette helped to inform the 2003 Center City Plan. And then in 2008, the Community Design Center once again was involved with the Downtown Vision Plan. And here you can see how that Union Street corridor has been further articulated. And so in 2013, the City of Rochester received an award of a Tiger Grant funding to pay for this project. This project entailed the filling in of the inner loop. It entailed creating a surface roadway, creating bridges to reconnect so many of the streets that have been severed as a result of the Great Moat. And it created this open land that was made available for development. And so this is the inner loop as it was. I want you to pay particular attention to this building up here. Here it is once again, once the at-grade roadway was installed. And here we are today. This is the pedestrian and cyclist perspective. And here, very similar to a few views that Ben showed, you start to see the development. You very clearly see this development of all of these buildings that are now where the inner loop used to be. And currently, this parcel has also been filled. And this is an aerial view looking north of the inner loop. And this is the parking lot that I asked you to pay attention to. This is the view as it is currently. This is a parking garage that was built as part of the Strong Museum expansion. And that freed up all of this land to be developed as a mixed use neighborhood, which is being called the neighborhood of play. Here you see a schematic of the plan for this neighborhood development. This is a private development. So this is some of that $220 million of private investment that was leveraged. This is the museum. This is the new parking garage. These are the proposed buildings along an interior street. And these are the buildings that are occupying the sunken roadway that was the inner loop. And here you see a rendering of what that interior street could look like. And so now we are considering how we're going to handle the Inner Loop North. So the city of Rochester hired a consultant to do a planning study. The consultants were, they've done a tremendous job in gathering community input despite the pandemic, and while also doing a tremendous amount of analytical research. One of the first things we needed to do was, fortunately, the city of Rochester recently adopted a new comprehensive 2034 plan. And the first priority was to make sure that any of the goals for this proposal aligned with those identified in the comp plan, both in regards to the policies and also as well for placemaking. And so the city and the consultants made community engagement a top priority and quickly organized a community advisory committee that consisted of representatives of many stakeholder groups in the community. I was very fortunate to participate on the racial equity subcommittee, which worked tirelessly throughout the year to research the history of the neighborhood, identify ways that the equity needed to be considered, and developed a racial equity analysis tool, which you see listed up here. This was a way that we wanted to be able to compare side by side each of the proposals that might be considered as it regarded equity. And we brainstormed about restorative practices. These are the many topic areas that were identified and discussed. And this is our group on a summer day last summer, out walking the neighborhood. And you can see one of the members of our group is someone who uses a wheelchair. And even for so many of us who are knowledgeable about mobility, we're just absolutely shocked at the tremendous obstacles and challenges that she faced in just being able to navigate city streets and sidewalks. And this led to making racial equity one of the prominent considerations across all of the design focus areas. I want to give a huge shout out to Hinge Neighbors. It was an organization that was founded before the Inner Loop North project was even envisioned. They have enlisted the help of the Community Design Center and Landmark Society of Western New York to help empower local residents so that they can articulate their vision. And so here you see the defined study area. This area that is in blue inside of the border is the Inner Loop North roadway. You can see that the study area encompasses quite a number of distinct neighborhoods. And some of the challenges that we face are the connection to the existing 490 expressway that connects the city of Rochester to the Interstate 90. This crossing of the river, which is adjacent to a railroad bridge, which is directly over our 90-foot waterfall in the river. You have this building here, which was the Central Post Office, which is no longer located there, but the building is still quite a significant historic structure. And directly across from it was Franklin Square, which was severed in half as a result of the Inner Loop. And we have a school here, a public school that has been completely isolated and has no playgrounds or green space around it. The other issue is the fact that we have rather affluent neighborhoods that are on this side of the Inner Loop, and this neighborhood, which is a very well-defined residential neighborhood, is one of the most challenged neighborhoods in our community. So one of the challenges that we face, or one of the opportunities we have, is that we're able to knit together the fabric of the city through this development process in a way that hopefully can be very diverse and implement many of the newest trends and strategies that we know from mixed use development. And so I show this image just to show you a little bit of all that was lost through our urban renewal process. Entire blocks were deleted and removed to create this roadway. And in the lower image, you see what a negative impact the Inner Loop North has had on this residential neighborhood directly adjacent to it. And this is to show you, and here the interesting thing is that not one of the dozen or so buildings that existed on this site exist here today. And if you'll take note, there are more lanes than cars in this image. And so this is a little bit of what was lost. We see that the Inner Loop North tore through entire blocks of streets just like this one. How can we repair the damage that was done? And are there restorative practices that we can implement to start the healing? These are some of the questions that we need to answer. Interestingly, I found this image just a few days ago. This is from the Rochester downtown charrette in 2000. It might be hard for you to see, but very faintly is the outline of the inner loop in yellow. And this is one of the solutions that was proposed 20 years ago for the removal of the inner loop. Interestingly enough, what it did was it just reintegrated the existing urban street grid. And so we've come full circle and recognized that the urban grid is the most efficient way to dissipate traffic, especially through a network of narrow streets that are designed to slow traffic, that are easy for pedestrians and all users to cross and enjoy. These narrow streets help to maintain a dialogue between the two sides, bringing both sides together into a common space rather than separating and dividing it. The solution erases that terrible scar that was the inner loop and frees the maximum amount of room and space for redevelopment in a way that we hope the neighbors will be involved in its creation. And lastly, I had the great privilege, the Community Design Center had the great privilege of having both Peter Park and Norm Garrick as featured speakers in our Reshaping Rochester series. And this is a quote from Norm. "You design a transportation system to nurture the type of city that you want. It's not just about moving people, it's about creating a type of place." And so with that, I leave you.
That was great. Yeah, it's too bad Norm couldn't be here today. And for people who are just joining us, he had a medical emergency and ended up being unable to attend today. So he won't be presenting at this point, but now we will move on to our final presentation with Peter Park. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Jordan. Can you all see my screen all right? All right, great. So I'm going to share with you maybe 10 perspectives. I've got 10 words or 10 phrases to go through in thinking about these initiatives to rethink highways in our cities. Choice, right? As Americans, we think choice is a pretty important thing, right? We really value the notion of freedom. We value the notion of improvement too. But we have to be very careful when we talk about improvement. You know, like, for example, at the McGrath Highway, do you think if these folks had a choice, they would choose to have that structure built in front of their house? I doubt it, right? Would that be the one that I would choose if I was given the option? Or in Denver, in under I-70, this was the route that families and kids would take to get to their school under this highway. And so one of my colleagues made this cartoon. He talks about, you know, street improvement, right? You know, and highway improvements, right? We got to be really careful with the language to be clear about when we talk about improvement, is it really ultimately improvement, right? So given the choice, right, would you rather have this kind of environment and using your tax money to be spent, or would you rather create these kind of places, right? So think about the choices, because it is a choice. Second idea is opportunity. We sit in a really important time. We have aging infrastructure. That's the bad news, but it's also the good news. We also have the phenomena of the return to the city and people coming back and seeking urban life. And we have a lot of successful examples globally to consider, right? Our public assets are aging and aging rapidly. Our government spends less on gross investment in terms of relative to our GDP. And you know, I mean, Washington has constantly looked for new ways to pay for roads and bridges, but the reality is, right, the purchasing power of the gas tax and the improvement of mileage of vehicles and the lowered rate of VMT, it's kind of funny, right? As our infrastructure gets older, it's going to cost us more to maintain, and yet the revenue sources are diminishing. I mean, the thing is, as you get older, it just takes a lot more to maintain yourself. Let me tell you, from personal experience, I can tell you that's true. The American Society of Civil Engineers does this, I think every 4 years, this report card of how America's infrastructure is doing. And, you know, our overall GPA in the United States, according to them, is a C-. In Minnesota, congratulations, you're a tick above. In 2018, you were grade C, but for your roads, you were at a D+. And if you look into this report a little bit further, what you find is that here's actually the big problem. It's the shortfall, right? The projected investment in 2018 was like $18 billion. The needed investment was around 36 million. And so you had an unfunded shortfall of 17 billion. When they looked at it historically, from the previous report in 2013, there was a significant gap. So you have this increasing gap between revenues and your estimated needs. And so this proposal that Jordan and his colleagues have forwarded makes I mean, you know, I used to live in Wisconsin. You know, Midwesterners are practical people. It doesn't make sense that you would continue to maintain a piece of infrastructure when faced with the realities of revenue and cost deficits. The other thing is, right, there are changes. I mean, when the highways were built in the United States, there was an idea about the future of American cities, and we've lived with that idea. I call it a failed experiment, right? And so right now, we know what the impacts that these highways have had in our cities, in city highways. I don't call them urban freeways because that's kind of too much of an oxymoron. You can't have urban and a freeway. They're completely opposite of each other in terms of what they represent. But we have the return of people to cities, and we have changing patterns of how we travel. And different cohorts and users, from millennials to baby boomers, are thinking about and actually behaving in different ways than assuming that everyone will drive. And we have a lot of great examples. ITDP, I helped ITDP on a kind of chronicling across the globe examples of successful highway removals. And as Ben mentioned, right, CNU has been doing an incredible job on chronicling across our country, particularly examples of these opportunities for rethinking. So one of the things I want to re-emphasize, and Jordan has certainly in his work pointed this out, is that there's a fundamental design flaw in the idea of applying a limited access highway to a city, right? Limited access is completely opposite of what cities are about and have always been, right? Cities have been about access and exchange, economic access, social access, right? Cultural exchange, right? And so if you take a limited access highway, okay, so going across I-70 across the countryside, I don't want to have a stop sign at every county line road, obviously. So limited access makes sense for that kind of travel, but there's not fabric of a city, right? Here, I mean, that's not right. And in fact, the original design for the American highway system by Norman Belgettis in the 40s identified, it was actually modeled after the Nazis' highway system, but it was have the high-speed road system connecting cities. You get off at a major city, it branches off and distributed into the street network, right? So it provides limited access here and robust access as it moves and connects city to city. And, you know, Jane Jacobs understood this. She wasn't a planner, she wasn't an engineer, she wasn't an architect, she was a writer, and she understood. So it's pretty intuitive to understand these things. You don't have to be an expert in this stuff. But what happened is, right, for a lot of different reasons, highways were cut through neighborhoods, and they were cut through every single example that we can see quite often in major cities, the poorest neighborhoods and communities who had the least voice at the time. But the reality is this, is a fine-grained network of streets performs better. That's how it works. If you had 6 lanes going east-west and 4 lanes going north-south, if you put them into arterial streets, which is the typical way that they're organized on a 1-mile grid, let's say, you actually induce more congestion and create more safety problems. If you take the same number of lanes and you distribute them into a street grid, you actually have more capacity. You actually have more road capacity, as well as you have opportunity to develop the land, right? In ways that are walkable and safer for people. So in Milwaukee, the problem of the Park East Freeway was that there were only 3 ways on and 3 ways off, right? Limited access in an urban grid creates congestion. That's the design flaw of it, right? So everyone at rush hour hurries up to wait, right, on the one-way streets that feed the on and off ramps of the freeway. And so by taking out the freeway, you create access so that people can get into the grid. You don't have to overshoot your destination and work your way through the street grid to get back to where you wanted to be, right? Because if you think of that design, what is it doing? It's inducing more travel. It's creating more pollution. It's putting more wear and tear on people's cars. It's like, it's crazy. Why would we create a system that actually induces more travel? I think if I was a tire salesman, I'd understand that that's a good thing, but that's not what we're talking about, right? Capacity, right? So this is about adding choices and making places, as Norm's quote describes, versus solving for congestion. We got to move away to think of thinking about how do we solve for congestion, and we need to think about how do we add more choices. And again, one of Ian's cartoons again, the capacity of a street. If it's a fixed geography, if it's a fixed amount of space, how do you prioritize what happens in that space, right? And so, you know, this is how much footprint this many cars take up that provides for that many people. So that's an extraordinary underutilization of land, right? And so look, if we had different ways for people to move around, like look, here's the footprint of people in a small bus, right? So it's about not just, you know, moving cars, but it's about moving people in multiple ways and creating places for people and thinking about the public realm, you know, the thing that all of our taxes go to maintain for everybody. So this takes a little different way of thinking about moving away from government spending and thinking about return on investment, ROI, right? It's a business term, right? But we need to think about prioritizing our return on investment for our local community and think about ideas about value added and value capture. How does public investment capture, right, value? I love this drawing from Milwaukee from 1909, when Milwaukee was a growing city, right? And what you see here is a boulevard, a beautifully tree-lined boulevard with transit down the middle, a roadway, wide sidewalks for pedestrians. And it's such a beautiful street that people would want to have their address on that street, right? That's a street. That's a way of thinking about public investment that drives private investment, that creates reasons for the private sector to put their money there and create and activate places. But what it takes is a street design that would be where people wanted to go to, right? It's a fundamental value capture perspective. Now, this was Henry Ford's solution for the problem of the congested city, right? Leave the city. That didn't work out. A lot of American cities and regions tried it, right? And we're living with an enormous cost of sprawl of our American city. So that's a bad idea. What happened in San Francisco, right, as Ben pointed out, is the freeway came down Did San Francisco suffer, right? They talked a long time about whether to rebuild it or not build it, right? Like China, how will people get to Chinatown? We'll lose money and the whole economy of the city will falter. Didn't happen, right? San Francisco has a different kind of a challenge. It's extraordinarily expensive and desirable. The freeways didn't hurt the value of property in San Francisco. If anything, it helped accelerate San Francisco's rise. So transit-oriented development, this is a term, TOD is the term that I think people might be familiar with. And the idea has been around for a long time. I really prefer to think about development-oriented transportation. That is, we make our choices about transportation to be focused on development, not transportation for the sake of transportation, not transportation for the sake of mobility, moving things around. But DOT is not a great acronym, right? In this regard, if we're trying to change our orientation. But development-oriented transportation is what, is the perspective that we used in the development of Union Station in Denver. We redesigned, actually, from the master plan, all of the components of the bus, the light rail, the commuter rail, the ski train, all of these components, Amtrak, the components of transit were reorganized in order to maximize the opportunity for development and creating a walkable urban environment of new development and setting for historic buildings to really shine. So I'm really about POT or POT, right? And don't get me wrong, not because I'm from Colorado. What I mean there is place-oriented transportation, right? That's the way we need to think about our investments in public infrastructure. So when the Chongqing River was covered over, capped with a freeway, that was removed. And when it was removed, it completely changed Seoul in an incredible way in terms of making places for people and sparked a river restoration and river cleanup movement. They took out another section of freeway. So again, there's no example of a city that was ruined when the highway came out. There's no example that I found, and I'm pretty sure Ben hasn't found one either, of a neighborhood that got better when a freeway was cut through it, right? So it's not theoretical. It's not theoretical. Every example has worked. But what it takes, I would make this suggestion, and you have a downtown plan, and your downtown plan gives you all the evidence that you need and support policy-wise to pursue this. But planning now is really important, and having an urban vision for your future. In 1999, we did a plan for downtown Milwaukee, and it was really a plan about making downtown more walkable and changing over from an automobile prioritized place to a walkable urban condition. Most of the recommendations were implemented within 10 years of this 20-year plan, including taking out the Park East Freeway. And so you can see, right, like this was the highest and best use of land, parking lots along the Milwaukee River, dripping oil and gas into the river, parking lots where neighborhoods used to be. And we made very simple drawings to imagine, well, what if the freeway wasn't there? What if it was surrounded by mixed use? What if we focused on transit and a new streetcar and new public spaces along the river? So we had a vision. It was adopted in 1999. We had no idea when it would ever occur, right? The freeway wasn't falling down, right? It wasn't San Francisco. But we had a local point of view about what the future of this area that should be considered when eventually this highway would need to be replaced. We were very fortunate. It happened much quicker than we expected. We can talk about this later, but ironically, Harley-Davidson motorcycles was the key to actually taking out the freeway, right? It's a very interesting story. The second thing is coding for predictable development, right? I'm on the Form-Based Code Institute Steering Committee. A lot of my work is related to form-based codes and rethinking how we regulate the development of cities. But this is something that local control, I mean, this is what Duluth has. You have zoning authority. So we did a plan and we did a form-based code that focused on street activation and making pedestrian, more pedestrian specific areas, in fact. And we created a very simple code of 4 building types assigned to an overall master plan and regulating plan that has been shaping new development in the area, right? And so what's ensued is a range of new kinds of development, from office to residential, yeah, lots of new projects from affordable housing at Convent Hill, which is a Milwaukee Housing Authority development, to a whole range of market rate, from luxury and mid-market housing. The new Milwaukee Bucks arena is here. It's called the Deer District, I think. Yeah, the Deer District. And a new Frederick Hospital in the Wisconsin College, Medical College of Wisconsin has a sports science center associated with the Milwaukee Bucks. There are new hotels, right? So the area, right, even in a city like Milwaukee, which had been losing population, development and urban development interest continues around this newfound land. Now let's talk about the land, because I think this is going to happen for you. And what you got to make sure you do is you make sure that you own the land, that the city controls the land. And so the discussions with the state and the Fed needs to prioritize swift land transfer for local control. So this is about 20 acres of land that was in the Park East Freeway corridor. You can see the neighborhood surrounding downtown, Milwaukee River, I-43. And this area to the north was called Bronzeville. It was the center of the African-American community before the freeway, and then after the freeway sort of fell apart. Not an uncommon story. But here's what happened is that in the plan, all of these yellow areas were land that Milwaukee County was the entity that acquired the land for the freeway. And so when the highway was decommissioned, the land went back to Milwaukee County. Okay, so think about that in terms of who will the land go back to. And by the way, we were able to negotiate not having to pay them back for the land, which makes complete sense. But I think some DOTs that are sort of considering these things are not always thinking about that. And they're thinking, oh, how much can we get for this very valuable land? Well, you know what? I think they should just give it back to the communities and let the community decide how they want to use their land that has sat vacant for all of those years. So in the case of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County actually sold a pretty major piece of their assets to the Milwaukee Bucks for $1, right? And that seems a little crazy, but there's a lot of new development that has happened because of it. And I'll talk a little bit later what might have affected some of the value of the land. What also happened in Milwaukee is a community benefits agreement was prepared, and the county committed to a variety of things, from prevailing wage to DBE, disadvantaged local employment, affordable housing, right? So again, when you own the land, you can call the shots in terms of how and what the terms are with regard to future public goods that you're looking for. Difference between how much control government has through regulations and how much government control has when they actually own the land. So the other thing about this control is to think about, so when we took this down, we only had enough money, and the state was not going to pay for removing the substructure, right? So what happened is, we had the funding to remove all the freeway, put all the streets back, build new bridges. Many of the columns and the footings below the surface, so you see they kind of cut them off here, they still remained underground. So those become a bit of a challenge in the redevelopment of some of these sites. But again, so when you take control, think about what you're getting in terms of what's underground, not only just what's on top. And finally, leadership, right? As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, and that's true. And right, there have been at the federal level, right, we are seeing some signs, and in previous administrations, signs of recognition of the problems of highways and cities, and the injustice of that. And we have the opportunity to rethink this, that's for sure. But ultimately, it is going to be local leadership that's going to change it. In other words, I think it's good that it's supportive, that we potentially have a supportive administration with regard to rethinking highways and cities. It's a great opportunity for us at this point. But it's going to take local leadership more than anything else to make this happen. This is John Norquist, my former boss, Ben's former boss, who was mayor of Milwaukee at the time, and then moved to Rick Cole's job now as leader of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And he was a very powerful man. Look, he's just thinking about taking a freeway down and everything's crumbling around him. It's like a superpower or something. So look, we should be optimistic, right? Technology, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do. We can make smart cars, but we need to stop making dumb places, right? And you guys have recognized there's land to be had here. There's opportunity to re-knit, actually, not just re-knit, but actually make a better network than ever existed in Duluth in connecting your city to the water, right? And in it, you actually have some land assets, actually create urban places, right? Congestion is not bad if it's people, right? If it's a lot of people, that's a sign of success, right? If it's a lot of cars, that's not a sign of success, right? Cars sitting versus people sitting, it's a totally different kind of experience. So just to summarize, success requires strong community will, support with extraordinary local leadership and political will. An urban vision, you have one in your downtown plan, for the city, not dominated by the automobile, that prioritizes short trips versus long trips, the walking trip, the bike trip, the transit trip. The decision process for what happens needs to be driven by long-term community investment, right? The return on investment versus spending a federal allocation on projects within a given time frame. One of the things with many public works and public agencies on infrastructure, they're kind of two phases of the project. It's kind of too early to tell or too late to change it, right? And so what you want to do is you want to really foment these conversations about long-term community investment versus just spending our money. With a focus on return on investment and priority for the local community, get control of the land, and recognize it's not technical, it's political, okay? Especially in the case of Duluth, right? You have infrastructure that is overbuilt for the traffic, right? And so it's not a question of whether this can be done or where will the cars go and will it fail and will be, it'll cause Carmageddon here. It's not going to. In fact, from at least what I'm seeing so far, I actually think you're going to have significantly, if you have congestion now, you're going to have even less of it, right? Because you're not going to have these places where people are just waiting to get on the highway at these limited access points. You're actually going to distribute those turning movements across a beautiful boulevard, right? So, yeah, so that's all I have. I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's been a lot of activity in the chat. So I guess I would like to invite anyone who had a question in there to unmute themselves and ask their question. Otherwise, I can try to read through all of this and summarize some of the points, but it would be a lot easier if you would raise your hand with the reaction tool that is down on the bottom of your screen and just said your comments or questions. So Laura, you've got your hand up already. You're up.
Okay. Hi. I want to ask, just for the specific, how long a stretch of highway we're talking about? Are we talking about the entire stretch that runs along Duluth, or are we talking about a short stretch of highway?
Yeah, so our project is basically just looking at the area from Mesaba Avenue, where the exit is there on the far west side of downtown, to the first tunnel on the east side of the 35 corridor. So It's just 1 mile of freeway that we're looking at right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You're up. And then if you don't have a question, or once you've asked your question, make sure you put your hand back down unless you have another question. Mark, you can go ahead.
Thank you again for hosting, and to all the panelists for their time. What are some of the key learnings from the approval process that we can look for applying for Duluth here? What specific studies turned out to be the most impactful? Was it support from key employers, financial subsidies, anything along those lines?
I don't know who wants to take that one.
Maria, go ahead.
I'm not that familiar with the financing process, so I'll have to pass on that one.
Well, if you mean, so if you mean the approval process, like getting the highway decommissioned, then is that?
That's correct. Yes. So ultimately, to arrive at the decision for everyone to give the thumbs up and the checks from the federal government, state, county, and so on. What were some of the initial steps that were taken that helped get those key groups on board?
Yeah. So I can tell you that so in Milwaukee we had the plan, right? The downtown plan, and it identified different development scenarios for the Park East Freeway corridor that didn't imagine the freeway staying there. One had to do with an entertainment district. Other just was more just regular mixed use and housing. And so that was the plan. The governor of the state hated the idea of taking out the highway. Okay. But then Harley Davidson was looking at building something called the Harley Experience, where they have their museum and they sponsor concerts and have a conclave of Harley riders from around the world. And they looked at the downtown plan and they loved the idea of having the Harley Experience at the riverfront. So they really liked this site. And so the mayor and I said, well, that's great. That's great. Can you tell the governor that you like it? And the governor is a big Harley fan, right? And so when the governor heard that Harley Davidson wanted the freeway out, he suddenly loved the idea of taking the freeway out. So that actually helped open the conversations about what to do with what had been some $25 million in iced tea money that the city, county, and the state hadn't come to agreement around. And because we had a plan, we had a vision, and we had, in this case, Harley Davidson, we had that started the discussions across the different levels of government to figure this out. So we had some funding. So then we had to do the studies and everything else, right? And I will tell you, it is a little bit of a challenge for DOTs, because like when they do an environmental impact or like whatever, it's designed to kind of assess, like, how do we mitigate the impact of this bad idea, right? If you think about it, right? Versus how do we mitigate, wait, this is actually a big opportunity. So, when we did the traffic analysis, it's like, oh yeah, no significant congestion, no kidding, right? We just enriched the network, right? So it actually moved pretty quickly after that, because we had the downtown plan already. So we had local businesses, local property owners, local employers, and local elected officials already behind the idea expressed in the downtown plan, right? And so it was just sort of that next step of going through the motions of all of the typical studies that one does, but all of them focused or ended up recognizing that the impact would not be negative.
Yeah, I'd like to say, people doing this work now have the benefit of all the work that has been done before. And certainly there's a greater awareness of all of the benefits of removing highways, reducing, roadways. And obviously political will sometimes has to respond to community desires. So grassroots organizations, neighborhood groups that start to organize around educating the general public about this, looking towards those relevant examples to help put this on the agenda for their political leaders. And then, of course, if you're able to capitalize on an opportunity, oftentimes so many big cities have something similar happen where a big company comes in and says, this is the kind of space we want to create. And all of a sudden, the opportunity presents itself.
And I would just emphasize, right, because as you go through this, you need to control the land locally, right? And you shouldn't have to pay back the state and the Fed for taking this out. And just, explain it from the perspective of they're going to make one last expenditure to take this out, and then this stretch will become a city street. It's no longer their responsibility to maintain it, right? This oversized infrastructure, and you'll create a beautiful street that is actually going to encourage investment that's going to increase your local tax base, right? So just in terms of the overall tax and value creation, it's in a much better place. The state of Wisconsin no longer maintains that mile of highway in downtown Milwaukee, right? It's a city street. So, Minnesota doesn't have increasing revenues that are outpacing the need for infrastructure. So other parts of the state could benefit from the savings that Duluth will bring to Minnesota.
Great. Laura, do you have another question?
Yes, just a quick one. During that period of time when the existing stretch of highway that we're talking about, this short stretch of highway, is being demolished and the new road is being built, what will happen? What do you foresee happening to the traffic that needs to flow through there?
I don't think you'd have a problem, but
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, have any of you lived through a restriping or a repaving of I-35?
Oh,
Like, the world didn't end,
no.
right? So, and so what happens is traffic finds its way, right? And what often happens in many cities is when the highways are getting repaired and people start using the local network, you see an uptick in local business activity because people are discovering, wow, there's a nice little bakery I never knew was there, but I'm traveling on the local street network. I found it because I'm not going on the big highway anymore, right? So, I don't know that there are a lot of upsides to it. It's really a question, as in any major infrastructure project, of how is the construction managed and the routing managed.
Thank
And
you.
there's been some research around San Francisco's Central Freeway removal and the traffic patterns that have come out of that, including during its deconstruction. And ultimately, a survey of, I think it was 8,000 or so drivers, 20% of them said they just skip things like discretionary trips, things that tie up and create congestion on freeways. They just didn't take that trip anymore. And the Central Freeway was carrying about 80,000 cars a day, for reference. So yeah, it's adaptive behavior. People find different routes, they disperse rather than concentrate. And construction impacts, that's the same sort of deal there as well.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? I'm trying to read through some things here. So one thing that's come up in the chat and in some of our conversations with local people is the concept of affordable housing and community ownership over the spaces that are being recreated and re-envisioned. And so, as was mentioned earlier, our downtown neighborhood is an area that has a lot of people who have, low income and would generally be at risk of displacement if a project like this would happen. Have you guys seen any good strategies for accommodating, transformational projects like these without displacing existing residents and actually making sure that they are participating in this, renaissance of their neighborhood?
So for the Interloop, I mean, very fortunately, we weren't displacing anyone because it was this big moat. But when the city undertook this project, part of the RFP specified the types of development that they wanted, and housing, of course, was primary. I think of all the development that happened in the Inner Loop East, nearly 50% is affordable or supportive housing. And that was dictated, I believe, right in the RFP. It's become a bigger consideration now as we look at Inner Loop North, because Inner Loop North is really needing to knit together these diverse neighborhoods together. And as I said, there's this opportunity to create what hopefully can be a model for building a new inclusive multi mixed use development that will in itself help bridge the gap between these neighboring communities.
And I think that's why Peter's point about determining who owns the land and what will happen to the land afterwards is so important, because if you get community consensus and buy-in around this project, and then the land reverts to the city's control, the city has a good amount of leeway as to how to build up and dispose of that land. And think about, in the case of Rochester, Inner Loop East, the city was very conscious about hearing from residents about particular services that the neighborhood lacked that they wanted to see built. Things like, I think there's a pharmacy and a daycare center that was, two things that neighborhood was missing. And the city included things like that in their RFPs when they put them out to developers, saying you have to build, this sort of a space for this sort of service. There's really an opportunity to leverage a lot of that, economic development and create programs and services and other opportunities that support people who are currently living around the highway. I'll also say a little bit about the community land trust model. I think that came up in the chat as well. This is essentially a way it's usually a nonprofit organization acquiring already vacant or abandoned lots, and then selling them to members of the current community so they have a stake in the ground when the highway is removed, and they'll actually gain some of that equity that comes out of rising property values. And if you're looking for a really good example, I'd check in on the 11th Street Bridge project in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. There's a community land trust there, the Douglas Community Land Trust, and they've done a lot of great work. The 11th Street Bridge is being turned from a highway bridge into a linear park, kind of like the High Line in New York. And this Douglas Community Land Trust has started already, from the start, before anything appreciates in terms of property values, thinking about how can we acquire these properties and get people, particularly who are renters, turn them into homeowners so that they get the benefits and they are able to stay through redevelopment.
Yeah, and again, I would just reinforce, right? This is where local leadership becomes really critical, because, right, to maximize what the city could do in terms of a range of community benefits, from affordable housing to DBE requirements to like whatever the range is, having the lowest basis in the land gives you the maximum range of what you can do, right? In other words, if the city has to pay a bunch of money for the land, they've got to recoup that money before you really have anything to create. So that's why it's something to think about earlier. Because Jordan, I think this is going to happen. You've made a great argument for your community. So
thank you. Rick Fernandez, you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, Jordan, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And thanks to all the presenters. Really appreciate the input that you've offered here. I'm calling out of Tampa, and in particular, the focus for me and for us here is the conversion of Interstate 275 north of the downtown interchange. Ben, you're familiar with this because you've been good enough to include us in the Highways Without Future lineup for a couple of years now. My question had to do with the process of feasibility study. Our Metropolitan Planning Organization board approved the concept of a feasibility study 2 years ago. But so far, we haven't been able to get out of the blocks to get that done because of argument about what that feasibility study should look like and how it should cost. The DOT proposed a study that was 1.2 some odd $million. A lesser version that we had embraced at a Citizens Advisory Committee level was more on the order of, $100,000. And somehow the MPO got stuck with the $1.2 million price point, and it really just set the idea up for failure. So what does a feasibility in the early stages of discussion, what does a feasibility study look like? What should it include, and what would be a reasonable budget point for it? If that may be too much to deal with in a Q&A like this, but maybe if you can just scattergun it a little bit. I appreciate it, and I'll go on mute again.
I don't know if anyone has a ready to shoot answer on that. I do want to say we are at 1:30, which was our scheduled end time. I'm not sure if our speakers are able to hang out for any longer than this. It'd be great if we could try to get an answer to this question. If you are available to hang out a little bit longer, that would be great. Otherwise, I can make sure any questions that are still out there, if you want to shoot them my way via email, I can get them to our attendees and see if we can get some answers.
I'm happy to hang out for a little bit.
I'm good for a bit.
I'm sorry, I'm late for my next meeting, but thank you
Okay. Well, thank you
very much.
Thank you, Peter.
And best of luck.
Thanks.
So Rick, to come back to your question, I'll point you in the direction of, it's not quite the same scale, but the city of Seattle recently commissioned a study on the cap of Interstate 5 through downtown Seattle. And I think it's a really successful example of what an early study could look like. I think it cost the city $40,000. And it basically does two things. One shows that, the physics of actually building a lid would work in terms of, the terrain and things like that. And then it imagines, so you've sort of answered a baseline question, can this work construction-wise? And then it looks largely at the demographics around that part of the highway and how they either have access to or do not have access to certain amenities. It's very, it's simple's the wrong word, but it's a starting point rather than a $1.2 million comprehensive study. And something like that could be similarly useful for Tampa or Duluth or something like that as well. Looking where traffic origin and destinations are, how people are using this highway. Is it being used for local trips? Is it being used for through trips? Who lives around the highway? How are they using this highway? How is this highway, either a barrier or facilitating certain types of access for them? And that could be a good starting point. Obviously, finding a local champion to get this sort of traction off the ground is important too.
Great. Does anyone have any other comments or questions? Last chance.
Jordan, there was a question here regarding, how do you propose removal of a freeway when there aren't any other transportation options? And that's certainly a big consideration. Here in Rochester, we are a driving town. For one reason, there really aren't any well-developed alternatives. We do have people in the city, and we are building out a cycling infrastructure, but it's not connected. And And we need to pay more attention to the opportunities of creating, walkable places. So I think we've learned a lot from the pandemic in that we've recognized that, people are becoming more engaged in their local communities, and that walkability is a key opportunity for people to move about a city that has things available to them in the near area. But we do have to, as we talk about removing highways or reducing roadways, we do have to take advantage of that opportunity to build in that infrastructure, the wide sidewalks that are well maintained year round. We always have this problem here in Rochester about winter, and that's an excuse for us not to do anything. But winter is always going to come. And until we resolve that problem, we're never going to have good walking infrastructure. There has to be a commitment made to that. But the cycling infrastructure has to be considered a part of a network, as it does, as it connects to the public transit systems. So removing these roadways or reducing these roadways gives us an opportunity to build out those other complementary alternatives that will be used if they are a complete system, as opposed to a bit of roadway. Like I was riding the other day on a bike lane that disappeared. You don't get dropped out of a helicopter on a bike lane and then get picked up where it ends. So hopefully this will create the opportunity for you to develop those alternatives that will allow you to make better use of your space.
And one of the good things about maybe the only good things about these projects taking a while, sometimes in the decades, is there are opportunities to put in alternative systems in place before a highway is removed. You can make those parallel investments, particularly on city-owned streets. I'm looking at that picture of Lake Ave. What could you do there on a street that will be an important connection to Canal Park? It is now, obviously, but it will be in the future too if the highway is removed. To make that a more robust, sidewalks, incorporating more transit or bicycling options into a street like that. And it's sort of an incremental approach to highway removal, where you're thinking about, the places that you control and have some ownership over first before the highway is actually taken out.
Great. Mark, you've got your hand up.
Just want to thank you, Jordan, for organizing, and this really kind of sets you up for a plug here. What do you need from us? That you've done a great job of coordinating this effort, putting this vision together. Is it reaching out to elected officials, city staff? You mentioned the petition in the chat. What else can we do to help keep this momentum?
I mean, I think, the email address I sent in, feel free to do that. We have monthly meetings, and this is kind of our stand-in for our June meeting, but we do those to keep the conversation moving, and we discuss a number of different topics and things we're trying to accomplish. Honestly, right now, I think the number one thing that we need to do is kind of organize politically to push on our local elected officials to make these things happen. All of our speakers kind of alluded to the fact that, at a certain point, this goes from being a technical problem to a political one. And so we need to get, the city, our MPO, and MnDOT on board with this idea, because they obviously are the ones who have the final say over what happens here. So they are, responded to us as people of the community. So if we can demonstrate that the community wants this, hopefully they will represent that cause and make something happen. Anyone else? All right. Well, at this point, I think we'll wrap up. So
I'll add one thing just quickly, because I see a question in the chat here about getting in touch from Southern California. And I'll just say, this will be my shameless plug. We, CNU, as well as a number of different organizations like Jordan's, have been putting together what we're calling a Freeway Fighters Network or something along those lines, getting people from across the country who are working on similar problems in touch with each other. So none of you are reinventing the wheel. But there's a listserv where we exchange ideas. If you want to be added to that listserv, please send me an email. It's B, first initial, Crowther, last name, CROWTHER, at cnu.org, and I'll gladly add you to that listserv.
Right. And yeah, our group is in that listserv too, but feel free to reach out to the email address that was in the chat above, info@highway61duluth.com. I'll gladly set up a time to talk if you're interested. So great. All right. So we're a little bit over, but thanks to everyone who hung out this whole time. It's been super awesome. It's great to see people from the community and people from other places that I didn't really expect. So yeah, thanks to our speakers again for being able to contribute some time to this. And reach out if you have any other questions. I'll gladly get them to people who can answer them. And thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
Great job.
It was great
Thank
to
you,
be here.
Maria and Ben.